If I can get everyone's attention, I'm gonna ask everyone to stand for a prayer. And with our heads bowed where we are, let us pray. Oh, surely I have turned myself to thee, trying to be upright to him who originated the heavens and the earth, and I am not a polytheist. Surely my prayer, my sacrifice, my life, my death is all for Allah. No associate has he. This am I commanded. I am of those who submit. O Allah, thou art the King. There is no God but thee. Thou art my Lord. I am thy servant. I have been greatly unjust to myself, and I confess my fault. So please, Allah, grant me protection against my fault, for none grants protection against fault but thou, and guide me to the best of morals. For none guides to the best of morals but thou, and turn away from me the evil and the indecent morals. For none can turn from me the evil and the indecent morals but thou. O Allah, make Muhammad successful. Make the true followers of Muhammad successful, as thou didst make Abraham and the true followers of Abraham successful, for surely thou art praised and magnified. And O Allah, bless Muhammad and bless the true followers of Muhammad, as thou didst bless Abraham and the true followers of Abraham, for surely thou art praised and magnified in our midst. Amen. You may be seated. In the name of Allah, the beneficent, the merciful, the one God to whom praise is due, the Lord of the worlds, we thank Almighty God, the revealer of all truth, the sender of all prophets. In that we thank him for Moses and the Torah, for Jesus and the gospel, and for Muhammad and the revelation of the Holy Quran. Peace be upon these worthy servants of Almighty God. But as a student of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I stand before you humbled as a student of his life-giving message, and in that I am most thankful to Allah for his intervention in our affairs in these last days in the person of Master Farad Muhammad, to whom praise is due forever. We thank him for his wise choice, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, his servant that he commissioned with the work of the resurrection of the dead. We thank Almighty God for him, and we thank the both of them in the eternal sense of the word for their student, their apostle, their servant, but our leader, teacher, and guide today, carrying on the great work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad here in North America, the Honorable Louis Farrakhan. And I greet you all in their names with the greeting words of peace. Salam alaikum. Welcome again on this Saturday, the second day of this historic Nation of Islam History Conference. We started last night here at the Camden Conference Center, a wonderful place to be. We found this place by accident as we were searching for places. Brother Lance called me about this place, and when we came and we saw the quality of it and the way that it's set up, we hope to hold other conferences here. We're starting out a little later today because we wanted to accommodate for the traffic. We were not aware that there was going to be a country western concert, and there are people coming from everywhere, and so we understand that some are trying to get here. We expect a lot more people here today than were here last night. As they negotiate themselves through the traffic, inshallah, they will be here as the day progresses. Today will be a day that will yield us a tremendous amount of information about the rich history of the Nation of Islam. And as we said last night, when you're digging into a foundation, another whole narrative emerges. On 6th and Market, the attack organization Avenging the Ancestors began a dig, and another whole narrative of American history emerged out of that. The artifacts tell another story other than George Washington never told a lie, and the many things that we were learning starting from primary schooling. But we found out that George Washington had at least 8 slaves. And as people come from all over the world into the United States, and they want to know the genesis of this nation, which really Philadelphia plays the key role. The First Continental Congress was here. The first black church was here. The Declaration of Independence, the 54 writers that put input in there for Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, that was done here. The first White House was here. So Philadelphia plays a key role in the genesis of this nation. And when the story is told, you never hear about the slaves. But now, as they dug into a foundation, something is coming up that's producing another narrative. There are many of us that are walking in the Nation of Islam today, and we have no idea those that came before us. We have no idea what the challenges were. Many of us are not really acquainted with how difficult it was to wear a headpiece and a garment in the public, what it was like to be a fruit of Islam, what it was like to have another name, and to stand up against a dominant culture that has been holding our people captive for the last 400 years. The Holy Quran talks about God's servant being on the farthest horizon. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said this means that he takes this last man further in his wisdom than any man has ever been taken in the annals of history. Something very new is coming out of black people in North America that promises to blanket the earth, a new civilization, a new culture, a new way of seeing things, and a new way of doing things. All of this is wrapped up in this conference called a conference dealing with the history of the Nation of Islam. And so last night we had an exciting time. We'll talk more about it, but we focused locally on the history of the Nation of Islam, particularly in the city of Philadelphia. Many giants in our nation were produced right out of this great city and this area of the country. To start off today, and we have a lot of hard hitters that have flown in, and they're making their presence even as I'm talking. But we're going to hear from Sister Indazar Sharif again today because we want to broaden the discussion. We are always taught that though you are female, you're still fighters. Though you're sisters, you're still soldiers. Though you're women, you are still warriors. And the women certainly played a significant role in this work, the programmatic thrust of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad called the Nation of Islam. And so we want to hear from this sister again, who has flown all the way from San Francisco to be with us this weekend, to share with us the work, particularly of the women who follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in the city of Philadelphia. Brother Askia Muhammad is with us, who was an editor for the Muhammad Speaks. And obviously, we have to put things in context. We need to know what it was like in America so that you have a sensitivity and a greater appreciation for the struggle of the average believer in the climate that they had to walk in once they accepted the life-giving teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Minister Abdul Akbar Muhammad will be with us, and he will share with us a lot about the history of the Nation of Islam. He has always been the premier Nation of Islam historian, Brother Akbar, and he, for those that don't know him, he probably worked closer than anyone with Minister Louis Farrakhan after his being assigned to the city of New York. And we're looking to hear from others. We're going all the way to the close of tomorrow's meeting at Mosque number 12, but we are happy for your presence now. And we're going to start off today by bringing up a historian, and one that I met when I first came to the city of Philadelphia, who had done a great deal of research on the Nation of Islam. He is a prolific writer. He more so than many who are outside of the nation, because most people that wrote about the Nation of Islam didn't necessarily write kindly about us. Most people that tried to grasp the essence of the Nation of Islam really failed to do that, because as Brother Jabril so eloquently puts it, if you don't deal with the coming of God, if you don't deal with the resurrection of the dead, if you don't deal with the fulfillment of what the prophets saw, you have not even begun to really deal with the Nation of Islam. But this historian was a writer particularly for a publication, the Philadelphia New Observer. and he currently writes with The Scoop and other publications that will take his articles, but he has a keen insight into the Nation of Islam from his research and study. And so I'd like you to put your hands together to welcome our own brother James Spady up to the podium to talk with us. Now, let's put our hands together for him.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to thank Brother Minister Rodney Muhammad and Mosque Number 12 and those who invited me out to speak today, because this is something that we've been advocating for a long time, the writing of the history of Nation of Islam from within. Most of what we've read in books about what they refer to as the black Muslims are works that were written by people who had an external point of view, who may have had objectives beyond what you may have as readers and as members of the Nation of Islam. This is a very rich history. The history of Nation of Islam is a very rich history, and it's impacted not only American society, but around the world. One of my most recent books is called The Global Cipher, Hip-Hop Culture and Consciousness, and there's been no religious movement that's impacted the hip-hop movement more than the Nation of Islam. And the same is true of the Black Arts Movement, although in the accounts that we hear now, we don't hear how the Nation of Islam was really at the forefront of changing the direction of the Black Power movement. As a matter of fact, I recall interviewing Minister Jeremiah Shabazz about his period in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm very glad to see that there's a new book out on Minister Jeremiah Shabazz, Top of the Clock. Number 12 has always been the top of the clock. So that's not surprising. The title of the book is Top of the Clock. But what's so important is that Minister Jeremiah pointed out during his experience in Atlanta that, number one, he was literally living right near Martin Luther King. He was living up the street from Martin Luther King. When he would go out for lunch over at Atlanta University, he would meet with two very distinguished professors there. One, the head of the mathematics department at Atlanta University, Dr. Lonnie Cross, who later became Lonnie Shabazz and later became a professor now at Lincoln University and then now in Texas. But here is a member of a Nation of Islam, a student at Lincoln University, and was the ninth black to receive a PhD in mathematics. The ninth black in the history of the United States to receive a PhD in mathematics was a person who later became a minister of the Nation of Islam and also became an assistant in the American Muslim Mission and other configurations. But this brother was taught by a minister from Philadelphia, Minister Jeremiah. And in Atlanta, that time period, it's very important to realize that if you were in college in the 1960s and 70s, you would see coming to the college campus speaking members of the Nation of Islam ministers. Many people who are now in public life heard first about the Nation of Islam on their college campuses, in their Black Student League, in their Black Student Associations. And that is why you'd see references to the Nation of Islam, but sometimes very obscure references, just shrill mentions of the fact. But last night I had the opportunity of doing a program with Sonia Sanchez. She asked 7 collaborators who worked with her on projects over the years to come to Drexel University, and we had a program discussing our experiences collaborating with Sonia Sanchez. Well, the first time I ever saw Sonia Sanchez, she was Sonia 5X. And she, if you look at least 4 of her books, the children's books especially, that's right. My brother Akbar knows that history, and I want to make sure that everybody here knows it as well. That those books came not only out of the influence of, but out of the actual participation in the Nation of Islam. That's an important distinction to make, because some people have been influenced by, but weren't participants necessarily. In this case, so you have of that period, you have major artists and historians. I think of Harold G. Lawrence, who did the early studies prior to Ivan van Sertima on the ancient blacks in the ancient voyages from West Africa to the United States. Harold G. Lawrence was a very important figure. In Atlanta, Georgia, you had one of the most famous visual artists in the 1960s, Brother Kofi X. Bailey, a painter whose works are exhibited in many museums. These people who were influenced and nurtured by the Nation of Islam, really Nation of Islam has a claim to part of that success. And I think in writing the history of the Nation of Islam, we need to just look at it several ways. One, as I view it, we need to have a comprehensive program in every mosque in the United States doing oral interviews with people 60 years old or maybe even 50 years and older. And this can be done by the young people who are sitting here today. This would be a good experience for them to get an opportunity to not only learn how to become audiovisual experts or journalists or print media or television producers, but they also get an opportunity to learn the history of the nation itself. And one of the best resources for the Nation of Islam are the people who were the practitioners. And this is true of any kind of organization in history. I've done history of the Marcus Garvey movement. In fact, working on a current book on Marcus Garvey and the impact that it had on the Black Power and the Black Arts movement. And there aren't a lot of people around who were around when Garvey was alive, but fortunately I began 30 years ago to interview members of the Garvey movement to get their stories. Wherever I traveled, lecturing or otherwise, I'd go in town, I'd give a lecture at the university, then I'd find time to interview either people from the Nation of Islam or the Marcus Garvey movement. So I began to collect that history. I recall one of the really moving experiences in Washington, D.C. I interviewed Brother Minister Benjamin Muhammad from Washington, D.C., and he was the person whose home was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's home in Washington, D.C. And at that time, Sister Clara, his wife, was alive too. And I sat at their table for many evenings, learning the history, the early history of the Nation of Islam from the period 1935 to 42, the Hajira period, when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad made the flight from Detroit and Chicago and was underground, so to speak. But during this underground period, it must be important to point out, especially in light of all the revisionist history, that Honorable Elijah Muhammad visited cities from Washington, D.C., Maryland. We know he did the Midwest. We know he did Milwaukee, Chicago, and we know that he did Detroit, Michigan. But many of us are not aware that Honorable Elijah Muhammad, during the period 35 to 42, went as far as Niagara Falls and Buffalo, New York. Every weekend, he'd be leaving the city of Washington, D.C., going out and organizing what would be the equivalent of study groups now, because they weren't large enough to be full mosque. And this he did throughout the United States, into Manhattan, into Philadelphia. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's last visit to a city prior to being arrested in Washington, D.C. in 1942 for a draft evasion, that visit was, he was just coming from Philadelphia, meeting with the brothers and sisters in Philadelphia in 1942. And he had been doing this from 1935 all the way through 42. One of the early people who helped to establish Nation of Islam in Philadelphia was Brother Charles, who had a barber shop, and he had been in prison and had learned the teachings from brothers who had been arrested at the time of the Nation of Islam. This is important because I'm not really sure that you realize that prior to Muhammad Ali, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had been arrested for refusing to fight in World War II. And he was actually too old to be drafted. But he was old enough and powerful enough for them to want him off the streets of Washington, D.C. and everywhere else. And so as a result, he was drafted. And when he came back from his tour, moving from Elmira, New York, to Buffalo, to Rochester, into Manhattan, into Brooklyn, and into Harlem, this is all prior to 1942. He stops in Philadelphia. His last stop was Philadelphia, and then he went to Washington, D.C. and was arrested. Now, what I was not aware of and what I learned from Sister Clara Muhammad, and when we do our interviews, we need to interview the sisters and the men. I mean, sometimes many of the sources for Nation of Islam history are strictly male sources. And there are certain things, certain ways of narrating the history that women employ that aren't employed by guys. Some detail often that you don't get when I do an interview with some of the brothers, you don't get the same kind of detail. You get other detail. So as a result, I think that what we're looking at is the way in which this nation evolved over a period of years, but also how it impacted. It wasn't just impacting people within the community itself. It was impacting the whole world community. My first visit to Egypt, I was surprised to know how many people knew about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. In fact, when I arrived in Cairo, at that time, his son, Akbar Muhammad, was a student at Al-Azhar University in Cairo and was also working with something called the Arab Observer in Cairo. And that there were also two or three other Nation of Islam, two were musicians who were living in Egypt at that time period. All these people have rich histories that need to be known and that someone needs to begin doing the interviews for. Going back to the narrative of the Honorable Muhammad's very advocacy of history. I mean, he's taught many times that history rewards all research, and that the reward comes not only to the person who is doing the history, who's writing the history, but those who learn from it from the rostrums throughout the United States. So that you get the very example of why there's a need for the history of Nation of Islam. You get the very example from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad himself, who advocated that we learn our history and that we write our own history. On another occasion, and these are just, Brother Rodney, these are just reflections on some experiences, but I had the opportunity of being at a conference on a conference panel with Dr. Cyril Lincoln, who, as you know, wrote the book, The Black Muslims in America, at a conference of the American Religious Academy. And Dr. Lincoln shared with me some of his experiences in doing those first interviews with Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that he arrived in Chicago without knowing whether he'd get the interview or not. And that he not only did that, but he interviewed people on the way to the home on, I guess, was it 47 Woodlawn Avenue? Was it South Woodlawn Avenue at the time period? It was on Woodlawn at that time period. He interviewed people on the way. Those interviews are really important to include in the history that you're writing of a Nation of Islam. So not only are you getting the oral interviews from the people who are around and have been around for a while, but you're also getting the archival sources. I'm not sure whether this has ever been done or not, but there's a real need for a central archive for the Nation of Islam, where all the correspondences and your oral tapes and transcripts can be placed. That means that people who are doing research on Nation of Islam will not just have to depend on the autobiography of Malcolm X or some other source that they take as historical accounts that are in fact autobiographies. And as we know, autobiographies are not history texts. They're simply personal narratives of one's life. And this is the same case in the case of the autobiography of Malcolm X. In most recent weeks, there's been much discussion about the new work, A Life of Reinvention on Malcolm X. And one of the things that I think people have been most discussing has been the use of sources. Not only what sources were used, but how they were used. And as you know, those young historians who are going to be writing history in the future, I know quite a few of you young ones out here today are going to be writing this history. So I'm talking to you as much as I am to the older ones. But in writing this history, you really want to make judicious use of the sources. That is, you want to make sure that the sources that you're using, you are being as just as you can in interpreting it. And you use your own discretion as to whether and how you want to use that source. That's very key in terms of writing that history. The other thing that will enable the Nation of Islam to be at the top of the clock in the scholarship area, because you've been at the top of the clock in the mass movement area, but in the area of scholarship, is to begin reading some of the works of people who were scholars in the Nation of Islam, including the brother who taught at Stanford University. Brother Akbar, what's the brother who taught at Stanford University in the psychology department and wrote these early works on black psychology. Some of the pioneer work on black psychology were done by, we know Naima Akbar did it later on, but these early works in black psychology were done by a group of people who were in the Nation of Islam and who had PhDs in psychology. And I think especially of the people at Stanford. Wade Nobles and those guys were a part of a group that were associated with Mosque number 27 in San Francisco. Ken Clark was one. And there was another brother who taught at Stanford who did a debate with Shockley. He did a debate with William Shockley, as you know, was very popular on Stanford's campus at that time period. And there was a brother who at that time was very active and also wrote works in psychology. He edited a special review, a special issue of a journal of psychology and human issues. And that was very uncommon for not only for a black to do it, but certainly for a person who was a Muslim to do that. He did a work called Voodoo Psychology. And there were two other co-authors with him. I'll think of it later on. But these were the pioneers. We mentioned a pioneer from Nation of Islam in the area of mathematics. Certainly, it would be someone like Brother Dr. Lonnie Shabazz. Then, of course, in the arts field, you have people who were contributing, like not only Sonia Sanchez, but one of the most famous plays done by Miri Baraka was Black Mass. And the whole history of Yaqub is brought into a theatric environment for the first time by he was the very best-known black playwright at the time period, had won the Obie Award already, and he wrote this play called Black Mass. Well, those who read that will know that those in the Nation of Islam who read it will know automatically where the source is. But also, the person who scored the music for this play called Black Mass, based on Mr. Yaqub, is none other than Sun Ra. Sun Ra, and how many of you even heard of the Sun Ra Orchestra? Sun Ra Orchestra. Well, yeah, good, see? Sun Ra Orchestra. Sun Ra was really one of the pioneer musicians to use a big band at that time period. And it's a transition period in jazz. I'm not sure you realize it's the period that Miles Davis, who was at the forefront of the bebop era, is beginning to make shifts after having come in contact with Jimi Hendrix. And there was a very famous album that sort of marked that time. But you see, and even people like Miles Davis, I had the opportunity of interviewing him. What I found is that in interviewing, and as a historian and journalist, I've had the opportunity to interview a number of these people. And when you get them one-on-one, they often will be very willing to tell you about the way the Nation of Islam impacted them. I don't know how many of you have heard of the singer Etta James. Etta James was a very influential teacher of Islam in Atlanta. Etta James, we know her now as a very famous blues singer, but she was known as a teacher. In fact, she had contact with Muhammad Ali very early on. And imagine a black woman who was a major entertainer back in that time period and joining the Nation of Islam at that period, and then continuing her career. And now when you see Etta James, you never even think of her contact with the nation and the impact it had on her as a blues singer. But then you look throughout these corners of history, and what we have in 2011, especially in light of all the new material coming out on the Nation of Islam and its participants, it's an excellent time for the Nation of Islam to come the helm of this new scholarship on the Nation of Islam. And that can be done very easily. I mean, the advantage of doing the history within the Nation of Islam is that these are people who you see every day at the mosque. And so on a Tuesday or Wednesday, spend an extra hour, begin interviewing them, and begin transcribing them, and begin to getting that rich history down. Even at this conference here, so many people who have played such an important role. I look at our brother Akbar Muhammad, who was an editor of Muhammad Speaks. I'm sorry, I keep saying Akbar. Askir Muhammad. Akbar is out in the hallway. But Askir Muhammad, who's editor of Muhammad Speaks. Well, that whole experience, Muhammad Speaks is an institution that needs a history of itself. We need to know the history of that. The editors, I guess John Woodford was before you and Leon Forrest as well, right? And before that, Dan Burley. right? Richard Durham, and then Dan Burley. Okay, so Richard.
Dan Burley was first, and then Richard Durham.
That's right.
And then John Woodford.
That's right. 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 So you're like the 6th or 7th in succession, right? And that day, Muhammad Speaks newspaper, whenever you travel around the world, you'd see people with copies of Muhammad Speaks. As a matter of fact, the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, do you realize that Kwame Nkrumah developed a way of receiving Muhammad Speaks newspaper because it couldn't be sent to him directly at a time period. And Kwame Nkrumah, how many of you remember Sister Tristine X. Johnson, who was this brother here remembers her. She was the principal of Clark Muhammad School in Chicago. But she, at the same time, traveled. She was a friend of Nkrumah from the 1940s, and she managed to make sure that these newspapers were gotten into Kwame Nkrumah. So the impact of the Nation of Islam is not only in terms of what it's done in various cities around the country, it also impact is global. And the global impact, I think, for instance, right now, of the global hip-hop movement. First of all, you have to understand that in France, which is the 2nd largest market for hip-hop in the United States, over 85 or 90% of the rappers are Muslim. And they are from North African countries. They're from Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, various places you've been reading in the news in the last 3 months. And they're also from West Africa, Mali and Guinea and Senegal. And so you have, not only do you get this music, this material being disseminated through the newspaper, and of course in the UK and also in France, the Muhammad Speaks, there are mosques there, and so therefore the Muhammad Speaks are being sold on the streets in France as we talk. Brother Hillary, I think it was there. Right, Minister Hillary, I think was minister there, but he's done an excellent job of using. Also, they're using new social media, new social networks is a very important way of getting this message across, and also conducting some of your oral interviews online. I mean, if you can't travel to Boston or Cincinnati, then you can very well do these through emails online. And that once this is done, once the archive materials are collected, then to write that history, your next move is to transcribe these tapes in various formats. And of course, if you use Brother Rubin's example, you would also videotape them as well. You wouldn't just be audio tape them as you did in the very beginning. You'll videotape it as well. And then there's another unknown resource for Nation of Islam history, and it's the University of Chicago. I've had the opportunity of using the archives there, but that University of Chicago archives is very important because one of the pioneer sociologists, Professor Lewis Worth, interviewed Master Fard Muhammad. And those interviews, and two archives I visited that have very important sources that some of the scholars in here today might want to look at. At the University of Michigan, there are the papers of Professor Erdman Bainan, who really published the first scholarly article on the Nation of Islam in 1933 or 34. Sociologist from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And at the Bentley Library in Michigan, and also in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan Library, there are all these sources that have not been tapped yet. But at the University of Chicago are the papers of Lewis Worth, and these sociologists who had an interest in Nation of Islam began studying it very early on, as did Professor Bainan out in the University of Michigan. Those sources have not been cited at all. The other important source that I've had the opportunity of looking at is, I'm sure my brother Askir remembers Shalaby, Ibrahim Shalaby, who was a professor at Howard University, and we spent many times discussing his history. He is a man in the 1960s and 70s who comes from Al-Azhar in Cairo to do his PhD on the Nation of Islam when many Afro-Americans in the United States wouldn't dare do their PhD on the Nation of Islam. He is an immigrant Muslim scholar from Egypt who had done his undergraduate work at Al-Azhar and came to Arizona. And he came to Arizona because at that time, the Honorable Muhammad had a home there, and he would have great access in that city. And he later wrote this dissertation on the Nation of Islam schools. And in fact, it's the first PhD dissertation that was written on the Clara Muhammad schools. And this is written by a brother from Egypt who comes to the United States and, of course, begins to point out the rich history that we already should have known here in the United States. I know, Brother Rodney, I have about 2 more minutes to wrap up. All right, I don't want to go too long. Let me just give me one signal, and I'll be right off. But, when I start talking about this history, brother, we can go on for another hour or so. And the good thing about it is that this conference is that it includes young people as well as older members of the nation. Because many of the young people in here are going to be the ones who are going to be doing these books in the future. You're going to be doing books like this. And you're going to be consulting the ones who have been around for years to learn that history, but you're also going to be using these archival sources that are just rich in the Nation of Islam history. I mean, the Schomburg Library is a very important source of Nation of Islam history, and yet it's very rarely cited, particularly in the vertical files, because there was a librarian there named Ernest Kaiser who clipped all these Nation of Islam, everything he saw in the papers in New York, he clipped it about the N.O.I. and put it in folders. And now those things have been digitized and they're available, so that it makes it much easier to do the research than it was when I first began doing it. I can't neglect the fact that this history, you think about the Nation of Islam history, is so closely aligned to the Marcus Garvey history. So many of the early leaders in different cities were former UNIA members. And later became members of the Nation of Islam. In fact, in Philadelphia, there were 2 or 3 occasions when the UNA Hall was a meeting place for Master McWelf. And not only in later period, but in 1940s, actually 50, 51, 52. Moving from Bailey Street, when you needed a larger place than Bailey Street, people would go to 1609 Columbia Avenue, and would use the UNIA building. And you would have reciprocal visits. The Marcus Garvey successor would visit, Mr. Thomas Harvey would visit the Master McWelf, and people from Master McWelf would visit the UNIA building. And so there's all this back and forth motion in the history. Also, I would encourage people in the nation to also begin reviewing these works. Most of the discussion about the books that we see now in the Malcolm X are not written by people who have the historical perspective that you have. So not only do you have the advantage of doing these review essays and publish them in newspapers, but you also can do them online with blogs. You can blog these things. It would be very important for scholars to be able to see the evaluation of these texts on the Nation of Islam that are done by people who have a rich knowledge of that history. And this is such a great thing that Brother Akbar Muhammad, I'm not confusing now, Askia with Akbar. Brother Akbar Muhammad has been advocating this history for as long as I've known him. And he's been advocating it in both Africa and Europe and wherever he's traveled and throughout the United States. And I'm sure that in the next 2 years, we're going to be able to see that book that Brother Akbar is working on, because you're going to help him to finish it up. And it's a lot of work doing a book like that, A History of a Nation from 1930 to 2011. So if you can be of help to Brother Akbar and wrapping this book up, because it's so important that text comes out, and it will be a book on the Nation of Islam from within. Right. And there are accounts that he will be able to provide from his close assistantship to Minister Louis Farrakhan that no writer outside can write about. And Minister Malcolm as well. So that's right. He goes back to the early 60s. And so each city you have, each city you go into, one of the strong advantages is that there are people in those cities who you walk by every day who are storehouses of knowledge. Brother Rod Muhammad's a storehouse of knowledge. Young people who are in the high school and college, and you want to do your term papers, you want to do something for you, why not begin interviewing Brother Rodney Muhammad about his experiences this is really important, his experiences both in Chicago and also in Philadelphia. And just the challenges of being a minister in a modern, technologically advanced society. You have to realize that at the time that the Honorable Muhammad began teaching, 1930s, you didn't have internet, you didn't have television, you had radio shows, and you had people word of mouth. And he didn't have a fax machine, right? So you can imagine how difficult it must have been to write that history at that time period. Think about the editing of Muhammad Speaks, a global newspaper. You think about the editorial policies that were set forth. I interviewed John Woodford about that early on. He's at University of Michigan now. And John Woodford, I think he'd been in Newsweek or Time magazine before he came into to Muhammad Speaks. So he had the Time and Newsweek style until Ahmad Muhammad had a conference with him and told him that, this paper is really designed for a different audience. Also, one of the first Nature of Islam publications, I spent a few evenings with Masco Young. And I'm not sure if you realize that the first magazine of a popular mass base was Salam magazine. And Salam magazine was published right here in Philadelphia on Ridge Avenue. The editor was Masco Young, who was a high school teacher. And he tells me his experiences of having his principal call him in the office in the 1950s. This is right after the Hate Produce came out. And this is one thing you have to know about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and his leadership. He hired expert public relation people to reverse that thing. It isn't just coincidental that the Hate Produce didn't do this. He brought in a top expert PR guy who was a public school teacher, but he wrote for Sepia magazine and Color magazine and other magazines. And he tells me that one day he's sitting in his classroom teaching, and the principal comes in. It wasn't very common in those days that the principal would leave their office to go to bring somebody to ask the teacher to come out. I mean, you waited until your term period was over, or people just didn't come to visit without an appointment. And standing in the hallway are two people to talk to him, and they are Minister Malcolm and Minister Jeremiah at his school in North Philadelphia. And the principal, of course, didn't know who these distinguished dressed gentlemen were. They may not have even called him to the office if they knew who they were. And so that they asked him, actually an article appeared in Sepia on the Nation of Islam that Elijah Muhammad immediately said, who's the brother who wrote that? That's how they used to do it back in the day. When there was somebody who was talented or skilled or an asset in the community, you would have Nation of Islam people go out and visit them or talk to them in the barber shop so that you can get them to work in the service of a Nation of Islam. And in this particular case, he asked, they said, the Honorable I want you to come to Chicago. He said, well, I don't really have any, I have a teacher's pay. I can't really just come to Chicago like that. He said, no, he'll take care of that. And when he got to Chicago, his wife went as well because she was concerned that he was giving up a teaching job. You realize in the 1950s in our community, if you were a black public school teacher, that's not the kind of job you would give up to go anywhere. And so she went out to Chicago and met with Sister Clara at the same time that he was meeting with Honorable Muhammad. And he said that it got to a point where he was saying, well, I really would love to take this job. So the Honorable Muhammad asked him, do you have any clients who are currently pastors of churches? He said, no. My clients are Big Mama Thornton and whoever the other blues singers were. And Honorable Muhammad said, that's all right. That's all right. So I think you can do some good work for Nation of Islam. And that brother managed to develop a media campaign that we've never seen included in the history of Nation of Islam history. He developed a media campaign that counteracted the hate produced. The hate produced was a very, very virulent kind of attack on the Nation of Islam, and it was chaired by, it was really a story originated not with Mike Wallace, who got the credit for it. It originated with Louis Lomax, who was a young a reporter, a black reporter with the publication, and that program, there were segments of it. It appeared. It wasn't one whole period. Every week, 5 days, there was a special on Nation of Islam, 1959. Can you imagine it on television in New York City? And that was the series that was the Hate Produce series. And Mike Wallace, of course, being higher ranked within the network, gained his notoriety as a journalist for having brought this history of Nation Islam out. And we later saw Mike Wiles on 60 Minutes. And but his early big story was the Nation Islam, and it was brought to him by a young black reporter who was at the Islam restaurant in New York City and interviewed these early people. The other thing I think I want to sort of, I guess, end by is the great wisdom and knowledge of media and social sciences and business that Ahmad Muhammad had. This brother and leader was a genius at media. Just go back and look at some of those early interviews he did with the Far East press, reporters from Japan and from Korea, because they actually mistook him for an Asian, for not an Asiatic black man, but an Asian black man. They thought he was actually from Japan or Korea. In fact, one of the interviews, they asked him, now, where were you from? And he says, I was born in Sandersville, Georgia, my brother. And of course, the reporter is very surprised. But when you go back and look at those tapes that Ahmad Muhammad interviews he did, there you have a lot of the history right there. Transcribe those. There's some more master's thesis and doctoral dissertation from those of you who are in the audience here. Look from within. You don't just have to do the topic of the President Obama's election. Why not just do your local minister and your local leadership in the mosque? You know, I mean, you can do those other works as well, but don't neglect. And this is what's happened. Many of you who've gone on to college have neglected writing about Nation Islam. You've been discouraged to write about that controversial, quote, sect, which was always being called. But you are really the heirs to this estate, the literary heirs to this estate. And as such, you not only have a great possibility, but a great responsibility. It isn't even a matter whether you think I should do this or not. You really there's an ethical responsibility to do that. There's an ethical responsibility to correct the wrongs that you see in the media. You're in a city, you see a newspaper, a column running. You should write a letter to that and say, I'm not really sure this is a life of reinvention at all. And you raise these rhetorical questions on talk shows, you see? And you go back and you really study this rich history. And you go back and examine the prison correspondences of Ahmad Muhammad to Malcolm X. And those things are available through the Massachusetts Prison Association now. Go back and then you won't have to guess about what he did in prison. You won't have to guess about how he got converted. You won't have to guess about the role that Filbert and Wilford and what's his other brother, Reggie played in this whole thing. Because you'll see correspondences. And those correspondences will help you trace the evolution of Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. And then you won't have to wait for somebody outside to tell you how this thing came about. And also you'll learn more about why he came to Philadelphia. He didn't come to Philadelphia to set up a mosque in Philadelphia. The mosque was already established in Philadelphia. He came to Philadelphia to settle a dispute. And he was brought in here by the Honorable Muhammad, Minister, I think Kareem was in Baltimore. I don't think the guy at that time was Isaiah Kareem. You're right, brother. Isaiah Kareem. And those two people hear about Malcolm coming to Philly. He sent both Isaiah Kareem and Malcolm together as a team into Philadelphia to settle the dispute. And that history, the new book does not really give a lot of history of Malcolm's time in Philadelphia. And yet it's a very pivotal time because those of us who know Philadelphia know that the way you did it in Detroit or New York is not the way it's going to be done in Philly. You know, I don't think it took you long to realize that Philly has its own way of doing everything. Philly and Chester as well. Brother Belgrade can tell you, man. But you see, that history, that's what gives it the kind of, the sort of tone and texture in the writing. It's the style. It's a style. And one occasion, they were in Chicago and at a minister's meeting, and the Honorable Muhammad was very good in preparing ministers to do more than what they were doing. And he looked at ministers and he called out Minister Jeremiah, and he said, Brother Jeremiah, with that wonderful smile you have, You telling me that your papers are not moving like any faster than that? He said, well, brother, we might have to bring somebody up here from Monroe, Louisiana to take over this big city. And that wouldn't be right because you are a native Philadelphian. The psychology he used in training the ministers, man, that's a whole book right there, man, right? The whole way that he encouraged you, he would always see the best in you. And even when you may have doubted that you could do what he proposed to do, he would encourage you in such a way that you would leave there saying, okay, yeah, I can do that. And that's what happened with Masco Young, who was a high school teacher. He left there saying that, maybe I can become the public relations director. And what Masco did is, the Honorable Muhammad said, well, now I understand that you and your wife have a concern. He'd bring it right up. He would come. You wouldn't have to be wondering whether he knew it. Now he always knew. You just want to know what time he's gonna bring it up. And so he would bring it right up. He'd say, I understand you have concern because you have a family of 3, and you want to know if we can pay you enough to match that teaching job you have. And he said, what I understand, the teachers are getting $657 a month in Philadelphia. I believe we can give you $692.42. We never knew why he decided that amount, but it was a show of good faith that I would not only match what Philadelphia school system do, I will give you more than that, exceed that. And by exceeding that, what you saw through newspapers throughout the United States was a change in how they were talking about the Nation of Islam. Because 59, they were a bit hesitant to talk about the Nation of Islam in a positive way after seeing the hate produced. But when you start getting, and the black press played a good role in this whole thing too. The black press, by the way, it has not often been seen as it should be seen by the Nation of Islam. Oftentimes the only friend in any city that the nation had was the black press. And it was not always easy for the black press to do these stories because obviously the advertisers are concerned when you see it on the front page, Minister Farrakhan. And on the back page, they're Popular Health Insurance Company. And so the vice president of the insurance company wants to know, we don't really want to pay for a wraparound ad that has Farrakhan's picture on there. And thanks to Hugo Warren, who was the publisher then, Hugo said, well, we're not going to stop running stories on Minister Louis Farrakhan. And it's because it was Hugo's father who was the distribution manager for the Pittsburgh Courier. He's the one who he's the one who helped to distribute Muhammad's column that appeared in Pittsburgh Courier. As you know, am I right, brother? Long before there was a Muhammad Speaks newspaper, Mr. Muhammad was writing in the Pittsburgh Courier. And the Pittsburgh Courier, after a while, began getting pressure and began getting word about carrying this column. And what is amazing in Philadelphia is that the first week the Pittsburgh Courier was brought here, and it was basically FOI selling the paper. That they were the sales team, even though people say Pittsburgh Courier had its regular black distribution routes. Let's put it that way, black stores and whatever. But the thing that put the Pittsburgh Courier in another whole category in terms of circulation was Mr. Muhammad Speaks column. That column, so it went from 30 copies per week to 5,000 copies. Can you imagine that? 5,000 copies in the 50s in Philadelphia, more than a whole state would have for Pittsburgh Courier. And they were reliable copy. They wouldn't buy it 1 week and stop. The same is true in Los Angeles. The black paper in Los Angeles, that they began carrying a column of Herald Dispatch, I think it was. They began carrying a column around about Muhammad, and that paper skyrocketed in terms of its circulation. So what you can see is the power of the Nation of Islam has residual value and it has exponential value. I mean, and in that way, it now needs to be used by the Nation of Islam to become the top of the clock in historical research. Thank you.
Let's give another big hand for Brother Spady.